scarcity and abundance when it comes to money. Here's the thing. In order for money to have value, it has to be scarce. This is simply economics, right? There has to be some level of scarcity, which gives money its value. Money gains its value through scarcity. So if that's the case, if money operates as a resource that gains value through scarcity, how do you have or create or maintain an abundance mindset? And the reality is there's so much money out there. There's so much capital available, cash. And like we talked about in other videos, there's probably 10 times the amount of money available as debt. And money is debt. So it's a bit of a paradox. So if you understand from the Fed's perspective, there's unlimited money because they can continue printing it, right? That's what's causing inflation. Of course, there is a finite limit at some point, the money that's out there. The scarcity in the economic model where money is basically a resource that's available that exists as an exchange of value for the purchase of and management of assets and exchange of goods and services. Understand that when somebody or a person, an institution, an entity, whatever it is that has a large quantity of capital, if you notice, they're always doing something. They're always reinvesting. They're always working with that capital. They're always using it. Somebody in a scarcity mindset, the average person, they're not tapped into, the field of abundance, right? The field of abundance is basically just like you are attuning yourself to the abundance that's out there. Nature is naturally abundant. The world is naturally abundant. Life is naturally abundant. And so if you're in scarcity for any reason, if you're in scarcity over, there's not enough money or there's not enough of a resource or something like that, what happens for a lot of people is they get caught up in this idea of scarcity or lack. And it usually has to do with some level of ignorance or misunderstanding or lack of understanding around a subject, right? So that's why I'm going so in depth on money in a lot of my vlogs, and also in the Elevate course, we're talking a lot about money, because to understand money, to master money, to master money, you have to have an understanding of money. That means you have to know what it is, where it comes from, how it works, and then you have to understand the game and commerce and business, and you have to understand all these aspects to really have a firm knowledge of how it works, how to use it, how to get more of it, and how to develop an abundance mindset. But you don't necessarily need to know all that to have an abundance mindset. The mindset of abundance is trusting and believing in the universe, trusting and believing in your ability, in yourself, and in the system, that there is money everywhere. There is money available and resources available for good products, good services, good businesses, for buying assets. Money flows where energy and attention goes. And also, it flows to those who are the best managers of money. So there is no shortage of money. So getting out of the scarcity mindset requires you to look at and understand that, yes, there is rich and poor. There is a wealth gap. In fact, the wealth gap is actually a lot bigger than most people think. But if you understand that this is actually a good thing, which probably sounds crazy to a lot of people, especially to somebody who's in scarcity. It's almost like you're cursing at them to say that, but the wealth gap actually is a good thing, because that's how money has value. Because people who are extremely wealthy, or institutions or governments or entities that control large quantities of capital, they're using that money to invest in assets, infrastructure, projects, that money is going to work. That money is being put to work. And so, for an individual in the face of these large corporations or these large entities, for example, like, it's easy to just get caught in this scarcity mentality. But if you realize that, that system, the system of wealth building, the system that these, extreme capitalists or these high level organizations are operating under, it's the same system, and it requires people to operate at both levels, right? So if money requires abundance and scarcity, there's an abundance of money, but it requires scarcity on a mass level in order to have value. Well, now you understand that money is everywhere, and for individuals who are in scarcity, you just realize that there's something wrong that you're believing about money that's preventing you from taking the action to get it. Money is very easy to get and to operate if you are in good exchange. And whether that's through working a job or through a business or whatever your mode is of earning income, a truism that you might hear is your network is your net worth. Now, this is relatively true because, yes, who you know matters, and there's opportunity when you're around people who think differently and who are tapped in economically in a different sphere, right? So there is that. And then there is, it takes money to make money, right? Well, I mean, that's somewhat true. If you're talking about making like massive amounts of wealth, yes, it does take money because you have to have large amounts of capital to invest. But actually, there are ways, obviously, to make money without money, right? And that's where you have to look at, abundance is a function of who you are. It's a function of what you stand for, what vibration you're tapped into, and your work ethic as well as your creativity, because money follows creativity. If the problem with the scarcity mentality is that, somebody who's just chasing money, it's the only thing they think about. They're not thinking about how to creatively expand their business. They're not thinking about other things to be creative about to actually get them out of scarcity. They're dialed in and zeroed in on money as a solution to all their problems. And the reality is, most of them, if you gave them a bunch of money, wouldn't know how to manage it and would probably just create more problems for themselves. So, but the reality is, you see, if you go into a big city, for example, right, you'll see a big spectrum. You'll see, Los Angeles is a perfect example of this, right? Like, you'll drive down the city and you'll see encampments and all this degradation and poverty and homelessness and all this stuff. And then you can go into the city and there's these multi-million-dollar skyscrapers and giant mega corporations and multi-billion-dollar corporations, and it's just this big spectrum of wealth. Now, if you understand that neither of these things can exist without each other, the system of capitalism couldn't exist without both of these elements. And most people, obviously, they're not on the outer edge of the spectrum. They're somewhere in the middle. So if you think about it, the entire system of capital and money is operating within this spectrum. And you have to basically work towards getting to the end of the spectrum that you want to be on. I don't know, maybe some people would be happier homeless and, have less problems, and then they could go towards that end. But obviously, if you're watching this, you probably want to go towards the other end of the spectrum, and that is that you understand that an organization that has billions of dollars is highly organized, creative, they're solving problems, they're providing value and solutions and resources and commodities and things like that to the public, to other people, to other organizations. And so, if you're following the money, that's essentially what you have to do, is look at, what is your organization? How do you creatively follow capital? How do you manage money? How do you manage your assets? How do you invest your money? How do you invest in your business? The abundance mindset is just recognizing that everything is here for you, and what you do with it, but I'm saying this is the perspective that I have, right? Everything on the planet exists because God created it, right? Now, what man created with the creation that God gave to man, we're not saying it's right or wrong or indifferent or better or worse or whatever. I'm just saying it exists, right? So the question is, what do you do with what you have? So the first step to get out of scarcity mentality is looking at, what do you have at your disposal? What resources are available to you? Because it's not a lack of resources, it's a lack of resourcefulness. It has to do with the mindset and the activity and the belief system and the way that you operate in reality. Because abundance is basically just assuming that right of, it's natural to understand that there are plenty of resources. The reality is, if you look at the cycle of life, the average lifespan of a human may be 70, 80, 90 years at most. And, so people spend many years acquiring wealth. There's family legacies that are passed on, lots of money that's passed on. Every, 50 to 80 years, that the wealth changes hands. Assets are sold. Of course, there's plenty of examples that this happens outside of the cycle of life, but this is just an example. 100 years from now, there's 7 billion people on the planet. And 100 years from now, none of them will be here. But in the future, those assets that exist today they'll be under control of maybe the same corporations, maybe different families, maybe different dynasties, maybe different individuals. That money is just there as a way to transact. It does exist to transact commercially, but it also really is a way to hold items that store value, such as real estate, gold, commodities, stocks, whatever something like that, right? So if you look at it from the perspective of everything is here, and first of all, stop thinking that it's bad. Stop thinking, capitalism is bad and money is bad and greed is, you say greed is bad. It is bad. But that is something that has to do with an individual, right? That's not the system. The system isn't greedy. People are greedy, right? So if you separate what's good about the human condition from the system and realize the system is just there and that you're a part of it just the way that it's a part of you, then you become an active participant. So the first step in actually getting out of scarcity, like I said before, is becoming an active participant in the system in a way where in a way where it actually makes sense, right? So understand the system exists to your benefit. So that's probably the first biggest mindset shift I would make, is understanding that everything in the system regarding money and other systems for that matter really exists for our benefit. And if we can look at it that way and understand, we can use these things to our advantage, that will kind of get you out of the trap. It's a mind trap to think that rich people are bad, or that the way that things are is bad, or capitalism is bad, or whatever. Like, most people, that's just a false belief that's implanted to keep you broke. And so you break that hypnotism and start looking at and understanding what the people who are great that actually made things happen, that changed the world, like Henry Ford. People thought he was crazy for thinking that everyone in the world would own a car. But today, everyone in the world owns a car, right? But that's just an example of don't think the way that everyone thinks. And then you look at, when you have capital, when you have an abundance, when you have money, you have a certain obligation to serve society. And, sure, there's a few like evil genius billionaires or whatever that somehow get a hold of a whole bunch of capital and they're evil and they do crazy things like, sterilizing third world populations or whatever these conspiracies are. I'm not saying that's true, but, there's that old stereotype of the evil genius billionaire, right? But the majority of people that money still flows down and flows to other places that are helping people in certain ways, or creating jobs, or funding different things within the world, right? So you become an active participant in the shaping of the world through capital. So if you are willing to take on that level of responsibility, then you can basically rise to a higher level of abundance. But the average person doesn't want to be a billionaire. Maybe they may say they want to, but the average person doesn't need to be a billionaire. Maybe they just want to live comfortably and build a legacy for their family. Well, you can do that very easily just by getting out of the mind trap first and then creating something with what's here. Because, getting into abundance is just tapping into a system that already exists.